A high school boy vanishes after accusing a beloved town pastor of abuse, but only his mother believes him. The pastor resigns, citing health reasons, and disappears from all official records. Years later, a mysterious letter, a hidden basement beneath the church, and a prayer journal filled with names reignite the mother's search for the truth. What she uncovers reveals a network far darker than she ever imagined. The last time Rachel Simmons saw her son smile without fear was on a Sunday afternoon, right after choir practice. The sun filtered gently through the stained glass windows of St. Elora's church, casting soft beams of red and blue across the pews. Everything about that day seemed ordinary, almost too peaceful to be remembered, and yet it was the final moment of normality before their world unraveled. 17-year-old Luke Simmons had always been quiet, a gentle boy with a thoughtful nature and a deep love for music. He spent most of his free time helping around the church, tuning guitars, setting up hymnals, occasionally rehearsing solos for youth mass. Reverend Thomas Dwyer had taken a special interest in him from the start. Rachel, a single mother trying to raise her son right, had been grateful for the Reverend's mentorship. She never questioned the closeness between them, not until that Tuesday. It started with a phone call from the school counselor. Luke had walked into her office and said 6 words that shattered everything. "I don't feel safe with him." The counselor had pressed gently, unsure if he meant bullying, threats, or worse. What came out was a painful confession. The Reverend had crossed a line, several lines. According to Luke, there were moments during late meetings under the guise of spiritual mentorship where the Reverend had touched him inappropriately. Luke didn't go into all the details, and Rachel could see why. Just repeating the claim had left him pale and trembling. Rachel's hands shook when she drove them to the police station. She believed her son, but part of her still clung to the image of Reverend Dwyer, the man who blessed her dying mother, who spoke with grace at her late husband's funeral, who held her son like he was protecting something sacred. The interrogation was brief. Reverend Dwyer denied everything, calmly and with measured disappointment. "It's not he said, looking right at Rachel, "for troubled teens to invent stories, especially when they struggle with themselves." He hinted, subtly but effectively, that Luke might be confused about his identity. The town took sides fast. Some believed Luke, but others, many in fact, rallied around the Reverend. "He baptized my daughter," one woman shouted at a school board meeting. "He buried my father. He's not that kind of man." Rachel's own sister told her she was putting ideas into her son's head. Even the church, while launching a standard internal review, quietly distanced themselves from the family. Luke's name was whispered in hallways. One parent demanded he be removed from choir practice until things were sorted. Rachel withdrew him voluntarily. Then, 2 weeks later, news spread that Reverend Dwyer had stepped down. The official statement cited chronic fatigue and spiritual exhaustion. A sabbatical was requested and granted. There was no mention of Luke, no mention of the police inquiry. Within days, the Reverend's name vanished from the parish website. His framed portrait in the church office was taken down. No one knew where he had gone. Rumors said he'd gone to stay with family in Vermont. Others whispered he had been transferred quietly to a retreat center for recovery. The diocese issued no further comment. The police, citing insufficient evidence and conflicting testimonies, closed the investigation. Rachel tried to hold her son together. Luke stopped singing. He barely left his room. At night, Rachel would hear him whispering to himself, not praying, just whispering. On his 18th birthday, he refused to have a cake. When she asked what he wanted, he said, "For people to believe me." That same week, someone keyed Rachel's car in the church parking lot. Across the hood in large jagged letters were the words. She considered moving, but their mortgage was underwater and her job at the clinic didn't transfer out of state. So they stayed, in silence, in grief, and in quiet defiance. Luke started therapy. Rachel stopped going to church, and Reverend Dwyer remained a ghost, spoken about in past tense, remembered in sermons only as our former shepherd. It would be another 3 years before the first real clue surfaced again. But by then, it would already be too late to undo the cracks that had begun forming in Rachel's world. It took 6 months for Luke Simmons to disappear from the collective memory of East Hamilton High School. Not literally, his name was still on outdated choir sheets and faded locker rusters, but socially, publicly, even spiritually, he had been erased. After Reverend Dwyer's quiet exit and the investigation's official close, a silence swept through the town that no one dared to break. The principal never spoke of Luke's departure. His classmates avoided his name like a cursed word. The community, desperate to restore its image of moral clarity, simply let the scandal vanish into fog. Rachel filed for an out-of-district transfer and enrolled Luke at a small charter school 30 miles away. She told the administrators it was for a fresh start, omitting everything that mattered. Luke didn't object. In fact, he barely spoke at all anymore. He stopped singing, stopped writing, and stopped caring about the world beyond his bedroom window. And so life in their old town marched forward. Hymns resumed at church, potlucks were scheduled, and the pews filled up again like nothing had happened. 2 years later, in the fall semester of 2025, Ms. Sheridan joined East Hamilton's faculty as a substitute English teacher, filling in for a maternity leave. Fresh from a public school in Albany, she had a meticulous mind, a fondness for archival work, and a habit of reviewing student files at night when the classrooms emptied. She believed understanding a student's background was key to reaching them in the present. That's what led her to the dusty registrar cabinet one rainy Thursday evening, sipping lukewarm coffee under fluorescent lights. While organizing attendance logs and enrollment records for her homeroom list, she stumbled across a thin file marked Simmons, Luke. At first, it didn't register. She remembered overhearing the name in a hushed hallway conversation. Nothing detailed, just one of those quick exchanges teachers have in passing, one of them muttering, "That kid Simmons." Yeah, it was messy. What caught her attention wasn't the student profile itself, but the handwritten date of enrollment, February 2023. Ms. Sheridan frowned. That couldn't be right. She flipped through the other forms, medical records, test scores, counseling notes. Most were dated well before that. One document showed choir participation in December of 2022. Another indicated he'd been recommended for a mentorship program as early as November. There was even an emergency contact form signed in October. How could a student be listed as officially enrolled in February, yet appear in the school systems 4 months earlier? She checked again. The original typed date had clearly been whited out and overwritten in blue ink. Ms. Sheridan's instincts tensed. She'd seen this before, in places where records were adjusted to fix mistakes, or more worryingly, to cover them up. She examined the logbook of editors from the digital registry system. Someone had manually updated Luke Simmons' enrollment status on March 2nd, about 3 weeks after Reverend Dwyer's resignation. She traced the digital ID attached to the change, admin_103. That login belonged to the former registrar, Mrs. Elaine Dobbins, who had retired early that spring. Miss Sheridan made a note. The next day, during a routine staff meeting, she asked an offhand question. "Anyone remember a student named Luke Simmons?" The response was immediate and uncomfortable. Mr. Kinsey, the vice principal, glanced up from his notes with a tight expression. "Why?" he asked. Miss Sheridan shrugged casually. "Found some inconsistencies in the file, just making sure my rosters are clean." Mr. Kinsey looked away. "I'd let it go, Sheridan. That's old business. Sensitive stuff. Just a lot of trouble, no clear answers." His tone was firm. End of conversation. But her curiosity was now awake, alive, and persistent. That evening, she returned to the registrar cabinet and dug deeper. She searched through email logs, board meeting minutes, even old school newsletters. It was eerie. There was a strange gap in the communications between January and March of 2023. No mention of Luke, no mention of Reverend Dwyer. But what struck her most was the absence of absence. For a student who, according to internal documentation, had filed a formal complaint involving a trusted religious figure, there were no disciplinary hearings, no parent-teacher notes, no legal correspondence filed in the student's folder. It was like the school had buried a body under paperwork and pretended the grave didn't exist. Later that week, Miss Sheridan ran into Janice Foy, a longtime cafeteria staffer, during dismissal duty. Janice had a reputation for knowing everything that happened behind the scenes. "Hey, Jan," Sheridan said casually. "Ever hear of a Reverend Thomas Dwyer?" Janice's face paled slightly, just for a moment. Then she muttered, "Heard enough. That's church stuff, not school business." Sheridan leaned closer. "But it was school business, wasn't it?" Janice gave her a look, a mix of fear and reluctance. "Ask too many questions around here, and people think you're trying to stir ghosts. Let the boy rest. Let the town move on." Sheridan didn't rest. She accessed the archive student files the next weekend with her district key. This time, she ran a search for any students who had entries redated or edited manually in early 2023. Only one other name popped up, Grace Mendoza, a freshman who, like Luke, had left without warning. The record simply read, her last documented activity was dated the same day Luke's enrollment was altered. Sheridan felt a chill crawl up her arms. What were the odds? The final piece of that weekend's discovery came as Sheridan scrolled through her personal notes and cross-referenced them with her digital backups. Buried in a subfolder from a forgotten cloud sync, she found an audio clip. It was a voice memo from an unnamed staffer, probably recorded on a phone and uploaded automatically. The quality was poor, but the message was unmistakable. A male voice whispered, "We can't let the date stay. If anyone looks closely, they'll start asking why he was here before the paperwork. We need to push it back, just enough to keep the timelines clean." Sheridan sat frozen. She replayed the clip, again and again. Then she did something no one else in town had done in 2 years. She opened a new document, titled it, Luke Simmons, Unresolved, and began typing. Rachel Simmons found the envelope tucked under her welcome mat on a Thursday morning that felt like any other, quiet, gray, and almost forgettable. She might have missed it entirely had she not stepped on it while unlocking the door. It was unmarked, no return address, sealed in a plain white envelope that bore only her name written in blacky, uneven letters. Rachel. She turned it over twice before opening it, some instinct in her chest tightening, warning her that this would not be something she could ignore. Inside was a single piece of paper torn from a legal pad, the ink pressed in sharp blue strokes as if the writer had etched every word in panic or fury. It read, "He never left town. That was all. No signature, no date, no explanation." Rachel stood frozen in her doorway for nearly a minute before stepping inside. She placed the note on the kitchen table and stared at it while the kettle hissed behind her, forgotten on the stove. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone, not to call the police, but to text Luke. "You okay?" she typed. "Just checking in," he replied 4 minutes later with a thumbs-up emoji. Rachel didn't mention the letter. Not yet. Instead, she turned to the hall closet and pulled out the plastic storage bin marked Church Old Photos. She hadn't opened it in years, not since before Luke's world cracked open. Her fingers moved mechanically through the disorganized pile. Parish events, youth group retreats, fundraising dinners, baptism services. Then she found it, a framed 8x10 of the 2022 Advent Mass, the last one Luke had attended. The image was overexposed in places, full of smiling faces and Christmas garlands. But something in the far right corner made her pause. A figure, mostly turned away from the camera, stood apart from the crowd. Hood up, posture rigid, arms crossed. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, but Rachel knew that stance. She had seen it every Sunday for a decade. She enlarged the image on her phone, using an old digital scan she'd kept. The man's frame, his way of slightly leaning to the left as he stood, the way his chin dipped toward his chest. It was familiar. Almost rehearsed. Her stomach knotted. She retrieved a second photo, an older one from a 2020 Easter Vigil, where Reverend Dwyer stood in clear profile. She placed the two side by side. The coat was different, but the build, the hands, the posture, they matched. Her breath caught. The letter's words echoed again. He never left town. Rachel wasn't the paranoid type. She didn't chase ghosts or find symbols in shadows, but the note, combined with the photo, rattled her in a way she couldn't dismiss. She searched her email archives, old church newsletters, anything that might suggest someone had seen Dwyer recently. There was nothing. Even his Facebook profile had been deactivated. But then she remembered something, the church's anniversary slideshow video posted on YouTube nearly 8 months ago. She opened her laptop and searched St. Elora's Centennial Celebration. The video was an hour long, full of history, clips of elderly members sharing stories, and footage from the event itself. At the 37-minute mark, the camera panned across the back pews during the opening hymn. Rachel paused the video and squinted there. The same man in the hooded coat, sitting alone. Same slight hunch, same gesture with the hands, thumb rubbing against the knuckle of the opposite hand, a nervous tick she had seen Dwyer do countless times during sermons. She rewound the footage, watched it again, paused, zoomed, her pulse thumped in her ears. Why would a man who resigned in shame, whose presence had become a wound for the community, return for an anniversary service? Unless he had never truly left, that night Rachel drove to the grocery store on the edge of town, parked under one of the dimmed lampposts, and watched. It was the same store Dwyer used to frequent, back when he still lived in the rectory. The cashier, an older woman named Dolores, recognized Rachel immediately. "Haven't seen you in a while," she said. "Still baking those molasses cookies?" Rachel smiled politely. "Trying. Hey, this is a weird question, but do you remember Reverend Dwyer?" Dolores blinked. "Sure I do. Poor man, left under, well, you know." She lowered her voice. "That was a real mess." Rachel hesitated, then took a chance. "Any chance you've seen him lately?" Dolores looked puzzled. "No. I mean, I thought he moved out east or something, but now that you mention it, there's a guy who comes in sometimes, wears a coat like his, keeps his hood up, doesn't say much." Rachel's spine stiffened. "Was the last time you saw him?" Dolores considered. "Maybe 2 weeks ago? Bought canned soup, coffee, those little travel toothpaste tubes?" Rachel left the store with nothing in her cart and everything in her mind. Back home, she rummaged through Luke's old notebooks. One of them, from the month after the church fallout, had a margin scribble she never noticed. He said the body is just a shell, but the soul hides close by. Maybe he's still close by. She sat down, reread the note, stared at the photo, and realized something she had missed before. In the background of the church photo, just behind the hooded man, a reflection shimmered faintly in a glass panel. Not the man's face, but a shape, tall, pale, watching. She opened the photo editor and adjusted the contrast. The shape remained. Not a ghost, not a trick of light, just someone else watching from the inside. Rachel didn't sleep the night she found the reflection in the photo. The figure, tall, faint, and obscured, had etched itself into her brain like a brand. The next morning, with the photo still glowing on her laptop screen, she brewed her coffee in silence, replaying every memory she had of the church's architecture, especially the old levels that had always been off-limits to the congregation. The basement, no, the crypt, they called it once, was sealed decades ago, converted into storage during renovations. Or so they had claimed. Reverend Dwyer used to joke during sermons, "Tyrian office notice to hide their messes." She had always thought it was metaphor. Now, it didn't feel funny anymore. Rachel dressed simply, jeans and a gray windbreaker, then drove past the church twice before she parked across the street at the laundromat and waited. The building looked the same as always, modest brick, flaking white trim, the steeple tilting slightly left, only now the signage out front read, "St. Alora's Community Resource Center." It had reopened months ago as a nonprofit outreach hub, offering food donations, warm clothes, and sometimes temporary shelter. What Rachel hadn't realized was that the operations were being handled mostly by volunteers. No one from the diocese was directly involved anymore. That meant fewer questions, less oversight, and maybe more secrets. She crossed the street with a tote bag full of expired canned goods and walked in through the side entrance. The main hall was filled with folding tables stacked with food donations and a few scattered racks of jackets and gloves. A young woman in a staff vest greeted her. "Morning, dropping off?" Rachel nodded, handing her the bag. "Thanks so much." The woman smiled, then gestured vaguely. "If you'd like to volunteer, sign-ups are by the piano." Rachel nodded again, but veered toward the far hallway instead. She didn't need paperwork. She needed answers. The hallway led toward the back offices and what used to be the rectory staircase. She tried one door, it was locked. The second opened to a supply closet. The third was unmarked. When she turned the knob, it creaked open into a narrow stairwell lined with dusty bricks and dim overhead bulbs. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The door had no signage, no warnings, no indication that it was off-limits. But she knew this was it. The old stairs, the crypt. The basement no one was allowed to enter, not even when she volunteered years ago. The stairs descended in a tight spiral, the air growing cooler with each step. The scent of damp concrete and metal filled her lungs. At the bottom, she reached a heavy steel door. A keypad had been installed, modern, industrial. That struck her as strange. Who updated a forgotten basement with security tech? She turned back, ascending halfway, before stacking at a window slit cut into the brick. Through it, she could barely make out the shape of crates, dozens of them, stacked neatly. Some were labeled Claire Clothes, Hygiene, others were blank. Back upstairs, Rachel lingered near the rear exit, pretending to check her phone. That's when she saw him, an older man pushing a cart of canned goods through the hallway. He wore a worn army jacket and mismatched shoes. His face was gaunt, but his eyes alert. She recognized him from the bus stop 2 blocks down. A known regular. She followed him out discreetly and caught up to him by the dumpsters. "Hi," she said. "Sorry to bother you. Do you come here often?" He looked her up and down with suspicion. "Who's asking?" Rachel smiled gently. "Just someone who's curious. Do they help people down there, in the basement?" He chuckled dryly, the kind of laugh that's more memory than amusement. "Downstairs?" he repeated. "They used to, a long time ago. Not anymore, though. Now it's locked up like a damn vault." Rachel pressed further. The man sniffed. "Yeah, back when the old priest ran things, before the scandal. He used to let some of us down there at night, said it was a temporary pantry, but it felt more like a refuge. Quiet. Hidden." He scratched his beard. "He said people judged too quick, that sometimes salvation needed secrecy." Rachel's breath caught. Did he ever say why he kept it hidden? The man shrugged. "Said not everyone deserved to see mercy work." Then he looked at her sharply. "Why do you care?" Rachel hesitated. "Because my son was one of the people judged too quickly." The man's expression softened, almost guiltily. "I'm sorry," he muttered. Then, more quietly, "He helped me once, you know. The priest, when I was at my worst, gave me socks, and didn't ask questions." That night, Rachel sat in her car outside the church again and scribbled notes in a yellow pad. The keypad, the crates, the unregistered access to the lower levels, all of it meant someone was still using that space. Maybe not officially, maybe not even legally, but the place wasn't abandoned. Someone had keys. Someone was maintaining it. She needed a name. She needed a schedule. She needed someone who had been inside after the church became a resource center. And just as she was about to drive away, her headlights caught movement by the side entrance. A man in a hoodie, carrying a duffel bag, unlocking the stair door. She ducked instinctively, killing the engine. The door closed behind him. She watched. She waited. 40 minutes later, he emerged. The duffel was gone. His hands were empty. But his gait, it was familiar. Rachel didn't want to go back inside alone. She knew too much now, knew that someone, likely the same someone who had nearly destroyed her son, was still accessing the church basement, still moving through it like it belonged to him. She needed a witness, someone who wouldn't think she was spiraling into grief-drew paranoia. That person was Helen Cart. Helen had been her closest friend for over 20 years, and, more importantly, she had lost her niece in the same church under similarly vague and unresolved circumstances. When Rachel called her and said, "I think he's still here," Helen didn't ask who, she just said, "What time?" That Sunday night, while the rest of the town slept off their weekend routines, Rachel and Helen parked 2 blocks away and approached the church from the rear alley where the trash bins lined up against the crumbling brick wall. Rachel had memorized the keypad's worn digits over weeks of observation. 4 of the keys, 1, 3, 6, and 9, showed more oil and grime than the others. She tried combinations methodically, heart thudding, until the lock clicked open on her 4th attempt. The metal door swung inward with a faint creak. They slipped inside, closing it behind them. The air changed immediately. It was heavier, colder, layered with the scent of old stone and something more metallic. The stairwell descended in tight turns, dim bulbs casting weak yellow light. At the bottom, they faced another door, this one made of wood, cracked and discolored. Hel reached for the knob, but Rachel stopped. "Let me," she whispered. Her fingers closed around the handle. It gave with surprising ease. The basement stretched longer than Rachel remembered from schematics she once saw during a church renovation fundraiser. The floor was concrete, walls unfinished. To the right stood stacks of crates, food donations, jackets, hygiene kits. But farther in, past a dividing curtain of tarp, lay something else entirely. A cot with a folded blanket, a plastic chair next to a small shelf lined with candles and religious trinkets. A ceramic crucifix hung crookedly on the wall, and there, on a folding table beneath the flickering bulb, sat a worn spiral notebook, a leather-bound prayer journal, and a wall calendar marked 2025. Helen moved to the cot and picked up the blanket. "Still warm," she murmured. Rachel flipped open the journal. The pages were filled with tightly written prayers, many of them dated within the past 2 weeks. A few entries referenced confession, penance, and rebuilding the flock. Rachel's hand trembled. These weren't historical notes. They were ongoing thoughts, confessions, rituals. Someone was living here. Someone was preaching, privately. She turned to the spiral notebook and immediately froze. The first page listed 10 names, each with symbols next to them. A few had a single asterisk, others had X's or lines through them. One name was underlined 3 times, Grace Mendoza. She showed Helen, who gasped, "Grace, that's the girl who vanished from the freshman list 2 years ago. I thought she moved." Rachel flipped the page, more names, some she recognized from Luke's old class. Jason Rowe, Ella Mathers. A few were unfamiliar. The last page held a single name, Luke Simmons, with a circle drawn around it. Rachel's knees gave slightly. "Why is his name here?" she whispered. "Why now?" Helen scanned the room. "What the hell is this place?" She moved toward a crate in the far corner. It wasn't labeled like the others. Inside were old hymn books, torn Bibles, and dozens of photocopied ID cards, student ideas. Some had faded, others looked new. Rachel reached for the top one and turned it over, the face of a boy she vaguely remembered. Alan Foster, sophomore, last seen 3 towns over. "Rachel," Helen called, voice sharper now, "we need to leave. This isn't just a hideout, it's organized. It's deliberate." Rachel nodded, but something pulled her toward the wall behind the cot. There, almost hidden beneath a pinned map, was a small cubby carved into the brick. Inside it, she found a plastic bag containing several SIM cards and a flip phone. She turned it on. No password, no contacts. Just one saved message in the drafts folder. She asked about Luke again. May need to move base. Rachel's stomach clenched. Move base. There was more than one. She snapped a photo of the message, then pocketed the phone. Helen was already backing toward the stairs. "We shouldn't be here when he comes back," she said, her voice shaking. Rachel lingered 1 second longer, scanning the calendar again. One date, just 2 days from now, was circled in red with the word "gathering" scrawled across it. They exited the basement the same way they came, locking the keypad behind them, walking briskly through the cold night with the weight of truth pressing into their backs. Rachel didn't go to work the next day. She sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the notebook pages she had photographed, the prayer journals she'd smuggled out in her coat, and the printouts of every school record she could legally access through public request channels. She had hardly slept, but her mind buzzed with a cold clarity she hadn't felt in years. Each name in the spiral notebook gnawed at her, She chose one to start with, Ella Mathers. A name she recalled faintly. Luke had mentioned her once, maybe twice. Quiet girl. Loved art. Her school records showed she had left East Hamilton during her sophomore year under the vague classification of psychological concerns. Rachel called the school pretending to be a concerned community volunteer, updating alumni records. The secretary paused before responding, clearly uncomfortable. Ella Mathers was withdrawn by her parents in 2023, the woman said. They cited emotional distress, but we don't keep clinical data, ma'am. I can't say more. When Rachel gently pressed, the woman's voice dropped. A few kids around that time had episodes. They weren't all reported. The school just wanted it to end quietly. Rachel thanked her and hung up. Her hands trembled slightly as she moved to the next name, then another. 3 of the students listed had similarly vague notes in their files: sudden transfers, mentions of declining academic engagement, behavioral shifts, or simply parental decision. It was all too neat, too sanitized. But one name, Jason Rowe, stood out for a different reason. His record included a counselor report stating, student discussed being involved in private spiritual sessions organized off-site by a third party. Administration never approved this. That sentence was buried in a sea of logistical notes, but Rachel highlighted it. She contacted Jason's old history teacher, Mr. Bentley, who had since retired. She found him through a local retired educators group online and sent him a simple message. "Did you know about Reverend Dwyer's private sessions with students?" He called her within 10 minutes. "I was afraid someone would ask that someday," Bentley said, his voice weathered and brittle like dry leaves. "I didn't have proof, not enough to go against the church." Rachel waited. "I saw some things," he continued. "He used to meet students after school, said it was for mentoring, but it wasn't official, no paperwork, no parent permission. He called it a ministry of healing." Bentley exhaled slowly. "Jason came to me one day," said Dwyer told him he was carrying shame and that he needed a place to unburden. "I asked him what that meant, but he just cried. Transferred 2 weeks later, family moved out of state." Rachel's voice was quiet. "Did you report it?" Bentley's pause was long. "I told the vice principal. He told me to keep my head down, that the reverend was handling it pastorally." His bitterness cut through the line. "I should have done more." Rachel scribbled notes as fast as her hand would move. Each testimony was a piece of something larger, more calculated. She circled the phrase, "ministry of healing," and underlined it twice. If Dwyer had created his own unofficial network of psychological manipulation under the guise of therapy, the names in the notebook weren't just students, they were participants. Or worse, victims. That evening, Rachel met Helen again, this time in a small cafe far from the center of town. She slid the printouts across the table, her eyes shadowed with urgency. Helen scanned them in silence. "They buried it all," she muttered. Rachel nodded. "But they weren't careful enough. Jason's note, Bentley's confession, it connects, and the journal. Some of those prayer entries mention soul cleansing, penance through isolation, and this one—" She tapped the page. "Only those who confront the sin of others within themselves can be freed. That's not theology, that's confront." Helen sat back, folding her arms. "What do we do now?" Rachel's eyes didn't waver. "We find someone still in town, someone who knew about the basement, someone who neither seen or heard things and never realized what they meant. They posted a discreet message on a local anonymous forum that night, posting as former students researching old mentorship programs for a project on faith-based education. It took 2 days before they got a reply. The message was short, from a user calling themselves Dustback17. "I remember the room under the church. I wasn't allowed to speak about it, but if this is real, and you're not police or clergy, meet me behind the train yard Tuesday at 9 p.m. Rachel didn't tell Luke. She didn't tell the police. She told Helen she'd go alone, but Helen insisted on waiting nearby in the car. Tuesday night came with a cold drizzle and a darkness that fell heavier than usual. Rachel stood by the rusting fence as freight trains groaned in the distance. After 15 minutes, a figure approached slowly, hooded, cautious. "You're the one asking about Dwyer," he said, voice tight with fear. Rachel nodded. "I went through his program," the man said bitterly. "That's what he called it. Said he was trained in spiritual trauma therapy. Said the school didn't understand kids like me." He looked away. "He isolated us, made us confess things, not just what we did, but what we thought, what we dreamt." Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "Did he ever mention Luke Simmons?" The man flinched. "Yes," he said slowly. "He said Luke was too loud in his silence, that he wouldn't break the right way. He said some kids were seeds, others were weeds." Rachel felt her knees weaken. "Where did he take you?" she asked. The man stared at the ground. "Every Thursday, after dark, through the side door. He said the basement was sacred, that it couldn't be tainted by unclean eyes." Rachel stepped back. The notebook, the stars, the X's, the circled names. They weren't just notes, they were records, symbols. Signs of completion or failure, and Luke's name was circled. The morning after Rachel met the young man behind the train yard, she sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes before gathering the courage to call the police. She had documented everything, the notebook, the prayer journal, the calendar, the confession, even photos of the cot in the basement. She knew this was no longer just a mother chasing shadows. This was something institutional, deliberate, and ongoing. She dialed the non-emergency line for the Hamilton County Police Department and asked to speak directly with someone in investigations. They routed her to a detective named Keene, who sounded polite but unconvinced. "You're saying a former priest is still operating under a church building, possibly living there, and you believe he's involved in some kind of unauthorized psychological program targeting minors?" Rachel answered firmly. "Yes, and I have evidence." Detective Keene agreed to meet that afternoon. Rachel arrived at the station with a folder stuffed with printouts and a flash drive containing all her digital records. She laid everything out across the desk in the small interview room and watched as Keene sifted through it. His brow furrowed at the notebook photos, deepened when he read the name Luke Simmons circled on the final page, and narrowed further as he reached the prayer journal's entry. But when she mentioned Reverend Thomas Dwyer by full name and asked for an update on his whereabouts, Keene typed into his system and frowned. He tried again. Finally, he leaned back and said, "There's no active file under that name in our clergy registry." Rachel stared. "What do you mean? He served at St. Alora's for nearly 15 years. He baptized my son. Keene held up a hand. "I believe you, ma'am, but he's not in the diocese records we have access to. No tax records, no driver's license renewals, nothing. The only entry is an incident report from early 2023, sealed because no charges were filed." Rachel's voice tightened. "So you're saying he doesn't exist?" Keene hesitated. "I'm saying on paper he barely did. That's unusual. Even retired clergy have traceable records, pensions, property, forwarding addresses. He's not listed under clergy retirement. No forwarding, nothing." Rachel retrieved the resignation letter she had copied from the parish newsletter archive. "This is the statement they issued when he stepped down." Keene scanned it. "This isn't a legal resignation," he said. "This is a public notice. Where's the formal dioceser file?" She didn't know. She had never seen one. That same day, Keene made a request through the archdioceser's liaison. It took 3 days to hear back, and the answer only deepened mystery. The resignation letter on record was a PDF scan, no original signed document, no witness verification. When Keene asked for Dwyer's personnel file, he was told it had been archived due to clerical error, and that retrieval might take several weeks, if possible. Rachel pressed further. She visited the diocese office herself and asked to speak with someone in clergy records. She was met by a polite woman named Janice, who assured her that all transfers and resignations were handled according to protocol. "Do you have Reverend Dwyer's final paperwork?" Rachel asked. Janice smiled faintly. "He submitted a letter in February of 2023, citing health reasons. I'm afraid we can't share internal HR document." Rachel leaned in. "Was it signed? Did anyone actually see him submit it?" Janice faltered. I'd have to check. I believe it was delivered through a courier." Rachel stared at her. "A courier? Not in person?" Janice looked uneasy. "Some clergy prefer privacy during transitions." Rachel left with a tight knot in her stomach. Back home, she called Helen and told her everything. "They have nothing," she said. "Vanished, not just physically, but administratively. He was erased." Helen replied, "Or never fully documented to begin with." Together, they began cross-referencing old church newsletters, event flyers, and bulletins. That's when they noticed another oddity. Reverend Dwyer's name didn't appear on any tax filings or property registrations associated with the rectory. The house next to the church had always been assumed to be his residence, but legally it was listed under St. Alora's Parish Trust, with no designated occupant. The utility bills had been paid monthly through the church's general fund. No individual signature, no lease, no personal paper trail office, and requested any records under Dwyer's name, driver's license, voter registration, property tax. The clerk searched for 10 minutes and finally shook his head. "Nothing recent. Last record we have is a license issued in 2009. No renewal. Address listed as clergy residence, St. Alora's. That's it. How does someone serve for over a decade and leave no footprint?" Rachel whispered to herself as she drove home. That night, while Luke slept upstairs, Rachel sat alone in the kitchen with her notes spread out again. She began mapping the timeline. When Dwyer arrived, the first known incidents of mentorship, the student transfers, his resignation, the sealed police file. She highlighted every gap, every time a paper trail should exist, but didn't. Then she circled a 4-month stretch from late 2022 to early 2023, where not a single verifiable document connected Dwyer to any official role. That was the same period when most of the students in the notebook had been marked with X's or stars. She picked up the flip phone she had taken from the basement and stared at the draft message again. She asked about Luke again. May need to move base. Someone had been watching her, monitoring her questions, perhaps even accessing school records, church records, keeping tabs on how close she was getting. The phone vibrated in her hand. Unknown number. One word appeared on the screen. Stop. It was Helen who first saw the name resurface in a school attendance report from a nearby district that she reviewed out of habit more than hope. She had gotten into the practice of scanning weekly bulletins from the Tri-County Educational Board, always with a lingering curiosity about the names from Rachel's notebook, about the ones marked with asterisks or crossed out with cruel precision. One morning, just past 6 a.m., she called Rachel with urgency in her voice. "He's back, Jason Rowe. He re-enrolled in public school upstate last week." Rachel sat up in bed. "Jason, are you sure?" Helen confirmed. Same name, same date of birth, same guardian listed, his aunt, not his parents. Within 2 hours, Rachel was on the road. The school was tucked behind an old highway exit lined with rusted motels and gas stations, far from the polished lanes of East Hamilton. She waited until dismissal, then approached the main office under the pretense of asking for volunteer opportunities. When Jason walked through the front door, she almost didn't recognize him. He was thinner, taller, his eyes sunken and distant. But it was him, the boy whose name had appeared in Dwyer's notebook, the boy who had vanished without a trace. Rachel didn't approach him directly. Instead, she left her contact information with the school counselor under the guise of being a community advocate familiar with his case. Days passed, then a week. She heard nothing. But late one Friday evening, she received a call from a woman who identified herself as Leah, Jason's maternal aunt. She sounded cautious, unsure whether she was doing the right thing. "She doesn't talk about what happened," Leah said, "but he's not the same. Nightmares, disassociation. He flinches when someone says forgiveness. That word alone seems to undo him." Rachel gently asked if he was in therapy. Leah hesitated. "He started seeing someone 3 weeks ago, a trauma specialist. She says he's guarded, but starting to open up, slowly." Rachel didn't press further, but asked if Leah could pass along a message. Tell him he's not alone. Tell him someone believed him before he even spoke. Another week passed. Then Rachel received a text from an unknown number. "Can we meet? Not ready to talk much, but I want to listen." It was signed Jason. They met at a small diner off Route 54, chosen by Jason for its anonymity and the fact it was just loud enough to drown out hard memory. He wore a hoodie, the drawstring pulled tight, and barely made eye contact. Rachel didn't push him. She spoke gently, told him what she and Helen had found, the notebook, the basement, the calendar. She watched his hands twitch at the mention of each word, his shoulders tightening like a trap being reset. Finally, he whispered, "You found the cot?" Rachel nodded. "We did." He was quiet for nearly 5 full minutes. Then, with a voice so low it barely registered, he said, "I wasn't supposed to come back." Rachel stayed silent. Jason continued. "He said if we came back before we were clean, we'd carry the stain to others." "That we'd infect them?" Rachel asked softly. "Who we? We're 4 of us. Not all at once." "But I saw the signs, the way he rotated people in and out. He said it was a process, that salvation couldn't be rushed, that if we doubted too loudly, we'd never be heard again." Rachel's eyes burned, but she stayed composed. "Did he hurt you?" Jason shook his head. "With fists, but he made us believe we were broken. He told us we had to confess every thought, every dream, even the ones we didn't act on. If we didn't cry, we had to repeat the sessions. If we asked to go home, he said we weren't ready, that the world outside would reject us if we left unprepared." Rachel asked, "Where did this happen?" Jason's jaw clenched. "The basement." "St. Alora's. He had it set up like a chapel, candles, a wooden cross, but he made it feel like a prison. "Did anyone else know?" Rachel asked. Jason looked away. "Someone brought food sometimes. I never saw their face, just heard keys. One day they left the door cracked. I waited hours, then ran." Rachel leaned forward. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Jason blinked slowly. "Because he made us believe it was our choice to stay. That leaving would make us the sinners. And when I did leave, he still found ways to remind me." Rachel froze. "What do you mean?" Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellowed, soft at the creases. Written in bold handwriting were the words, "You left early, but your name is still on the list." Rachel recognized the handwriting instantly. The piece of paper Jason handed her haunted Rachel long after they left the diner. She kept it folded in her coat pocket, unfolding it periodically just to study the ink, the pressure of the pen, the terrifying certainty behind those words. "You left early, but your name is still on the list." She couldn't sleep that night. Her thoughts wandered back to the phrase, "still on the list," and the basement, and the years of silence that had protected someone who never should have been hidden. It was clear now, Dwyer hadn't just disappeared. He had been moved, protected, assisted, and sheltered. But by who, and how deeply did this go? The next morning, Rachel met with Detective Keene again. She placed Jason's note on the desk and waited. Keene read it, eyes narrowing. "This isn't a threat in the legal sense," he said. "But it's part of a pattern." Rachel leaned forward. "I need to know where he came from. Before St. Alora's." Keene hesitated. "Clergy transfers are private, but I'll see what I can pull from the old rosters." It took 5 days. When Keene finally called, his tone had shifted. "You were right to ask. Dwyer didn't start at St. Alora's. He came from St. Melina Parish, 2 counties south, served there for 8 years before his transfer." Rachel asked, "Why did he leave?" Keene sighed. "A note in the clergy log, transferred for pastoral reassignment following internal review. No further details. But I cross-referenced the timeline with sealed files. That year, a minor from that area made an accusation against a church employee. The report was sealed. No charges filed, names redacted. But you think it was him?" Keene didn't answer directly. "Let's just say the dates line up too well to ignore." Rachel didn't stop there. She contacted a former journalist, Nina Morales, who had covered clergy abuse in the region years ago before switching to freelance investigative work. When Rachel shared what she had uncovered, Nina agreed to dig into archived sources. A few days later, she emailed Rachel a newspaper clipping from 2014. The article was brief, buried in the back pages, detailing how a farmer had been quietly reassigned following parish concerns about conduct with youth ministry members. No names, no accusations, no formal charges, just a reshuffling, a gentle push from one shadow to another. Rachel stared at the screen, bile rising in her throat. "They knew," she whispered to herself. "They always knew." But the next breakthrough came not from files or officials, but from the streets. One night, while distributing meals at a pop-up shelter organized behind the old train station, Rachel recognized the man she'd spoken to weeks ago, the same homeless man who had mentioned Dwyer's secret pantry. She approached him cautiously. "You said he helped you once, with food, that he gave you socks." The man nodded. "Yeah, back before the building turned all official." Rachel asked, "Do you remember when he left?" The man scratched his beard. "Sort of. One night I saw him loading things into the back of a white truck. Big one, had the logo with the cross and wheat on the side. Big one thing." Rachel's breath caught. "A food bank truck?" The man nodded. "Yup. Didn't think nothing of it. Those trucks come in and out all the time, but he was real sneaky. Waited until late, drove it himself." Rachel called Nina again, this time asking about regional charities with access to unmonitored transport. Nina called back later with confirmation. The diocese partners with multiple food distribution arms. Some are independent but still use the church's branding. Volunteers rotate, drivers aren't vetted like clergy. If someone wanted to slip out, that'd be one way. It made perfect sense. Dwyer had buried himself within the structure that protected him. used its resources to vanish under the guise of helping the poor. If no one was looking too closely, he could move quietly, undetected, perhaps even still in communication with those sympathetic to him. Rachel began tracking the fleet logs of Catholic relief trucks, looking for irregular patterns. One stood out. A vehicle assigned to Saylora's route had been out of zone for over 8 hours on the night Dwyer supposedly left town. No official report had been filed. When Rachel requested access to the truck's route log, she was told it had been misplaced during system maintenance. She didn't buy it. Worse yet, when she mentioned the truck to Jason in a follow-up call, he went silent for several seconds before whispering, "That's the truck he used to pick me up. Said it was safer, less chance of questions." Rachel knew what that meant. Dwyer hadn't just left town. He had a method, a network, a way in and out of communities using tools meant for charity, for grace. He was a ghost in the system, always a step ahead, wrapped in the illusion of faith and service. And even now he might be preparing another base, another ministry. Unless she stopped him, unless someone finally said the words out loud, in court, in public, in truth. But then came another call, this time from Helen. Her voice was shaking. "Rachel, you're not going to like this. I saw someone leaving the church tonight. Same coat, same walk. It's him. He's back." The church bell rang once at midnight the day after Helen called. Rachel stood outside her kitchen window, staring through the glass toward the faint silhouette of St. Alora's steeple in the distance. It had rained earlier, and the pavement still shimmered with reflections of yellow street lamps and quiet urgency. She hadn't responded to Helen's message right away. Something about the way she had said, "He's back," felt too inevitable, too final. Rachel had known this day might come. What she didn't know was whether she was more afraid of confronting him again or of never seeing him at all. The next morning, Detective Keene opened a formal case under the state's renewed clergy abuse initiative. With Jason's testimony now supported by multiple forms of documentation, Keene contacted the Attorney General's office, prompting an official inquiry into Reverend Dwyer's history, affiliations, and final whereabouts. They issued a warrant. A public bulletin was posted. Media outlets picked up the story, but every lead led nowhere. Every name Dwyer had used, every file that should have existed, turned into air upon examination. No verified employment contracts, no driver's license renewals, no financial accounts. Even the church, under growing pressure, released a carefully worded statement claiming that certain records pertaining to Reverend Thomas Dwyer may have been lost during administrative transfers and technological upgrades. Privately, a diocesan contact admitted to Keene, "We've tried to locate the original personnel folder. It's like it never existed." The food bank organization confirmed that a truck had been unaccounted for, but the driver's logs had been overridden in a software reset, and video surveillance archives from that date had been erased after 90 days per policy. No one could confirm if Dwyer had ever officially signed in or out of the premises. His name wasn't in the volunteer registry. When Rachel asked about the church building itself, she was told that the basement, now fully sealed, had been converted into permanent storage, with all access restricted by new policy. She returned one final time to the place where it had all begun. The cot was gone, the calendar removed, the wall scrubbed clean, but a faint shadow of the wooden cross still lingered in the brick, as if memory itself had stained the stone. Luke, now 19, had started therapy again. For the first time, he spoke openly about the night terrors, the compulsive guilt, the sense that someone had implanted doubt so deep he could no longer trust his own memories. "He made me feel like I owed him something," he told Rachel once, "like I was the one who needed to be forgiven." She held his hand in silence. She didn't have words strong enough to undo what had been done, but she had one truth. She had never stopped believing him. As months passed, the search for Dwyer grew colder. Keene kept the case open, citing ongoing public safety concerns, but internally admitted to Rachel that they had exhausted all viable leads. "We're watching border alerts, aliases, even offshore charity records," he said, "but he's either dead, protected, or moving with help we can't trace." Rachel knew which one she believed. The town moved on the way towns always do after scandal, with silence and vague apologies, followed by a strange willingness to forget. St. Lawrence Community Resource Center held new food drives, staffed by new volunteers who didn't know or pretended not to know the building's history. The community newsletters stopped mentioning Luke, stopped whispering about Rachel, and for a time, life settled quiet. Still. Until the package arrived. It was late autumn, nearly a year since the warrant was issued. Rachel found the padded envelope on her front porch one morning, wedged beneath a folded grocery flyer. No return address, just her name typed on a shipping label. She brought it inside cautiously. Inside the envelope was an old leather-bound Bible, edges frayed, cover faded to near brown. At first, it seemed like any other donation book, until she opened it. A slip of lined paper, tucked between Psalm 27 and 28, fluttered out. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten. In the same sharp, precise script she had seen in the notebook months ago were the words, "Don't stop. There are others still waiting to be saved." Rachel read the sentence 5 times, then again. The paper trembled in her hand. She looked around, as if expecting someone to appear in the doorway, as if the air itself might deliver a warning, but nothing happened. Just the distant hum of cars, the faint wind moving through dry leaves, outside. She placed the Bible gently on the table and stared at it. There was no signature, no date, just the sentence. A message. Or a dare. She picked up her phone, scrolled through her contacts, and found Nina Morales, then Helen, then Keen. She started a group message. "Something's not over. We need to meet." And as she typed, her fingers steady now, her chest no longer tight with dread, she understood that this was never about one priest or one building. It was about something deeper. A silence passed down like ritual, a system built to shield what should have been exposed. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one still searching. If this story kept you thinking, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Do you think the Reverend ever truly left? Let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below.